And I'll pass it back to you. Thanks, Melissa.
Okay, no problem. So we have a good sense that we feel that academic advising is a profession. So I have another, just to gather a little bit more information. So why or why not? Why do you think that academic advising is a profession? And this will come up as quotes. Is it, I'm just checking it. Yep, it's working. Okay, I see it coming up. Okay. Okay, so we've got a few great things coming up here in terms of requirements for specialized skill set. We have theories and models that inform our practice. So we're also talking about the affect that it has on students. And then I do see some requirements here for academic credentials. And so we might dig into that a little bit more. Okay. So what is professionalization? So it's the process of an occupation transforming into a vocation with the attributes of a profession. So now we have to start to unpack what are the attributes of a profession. So it's really about the study of how activities are transformed into occupations, which lead to a profession. This is usually studied within the field of sociology and economics. So when we look to those fields of practice, we start to see frameworks. We can start to look at histories of how certain jobs turn into professions over time. And I also want to sort of say that this presentation is not a commentary on our professionalism. So our ability to act and use our skill set within a common set of values and work standards that we use across the board. This is more about looking at academic advising as a profession, as a field of practice on its own, and where we are in that journey toward becoming a profession. So a lot of this started around 2009. So anybody who is part of NACADA, who has followed NACADA, will know that in 2009, 2 articles were written that were, I think, rather provocative. And I think they were meant to be provocative. I think they wanted those of us within academic advising to really think about the profession and think about whether we have pushed it far enough, whether we have consistency, whether it is understood, whether it is recognized as an occupation in and of itself. So in 2009, Habley indicated that academic advising is a field of inquiry. And he used the number of articles and research that had been done over the time on academic advising to come to that conclusion. So he sort of argued that given the research and the knowledge that exists, we aren't quite there yet. We've maybe hit the definition of a field of inquiry, but we're not quite a profession. That same year, Kewen and Paddock argued that although we are not quite a profession yet, we have distinguished ourselves from other professions. So specifically from personal, career, or vocational counseling. So we've gotten to the point where we can say academic, and of course it's been several years since 2009, but we're now at a point where we recognize academic advising is separate from counseling, for example. And so, but that alone does not quite get us to the ultimate point of becoming a profession. The other point is professions do not emerge in isolation. They emerge by differentiation from other occupations. So as Kewen and Paddock had sort of argued, and it happens when members of that occupation start to develop comparable skills, and those skills differentiate themselves, and the skills and the outcomes differentiate themselves from other jobs. Another piece is that within that occupation, you start to have authority and jurisdiction to make decisions within that occupation. And it's expertise is sought out. So again, skill sets to sort of complete that job. So where the scholars agree at this point is that academic advising is on the journey toward professionalization because it has distinguished itself from other occupations. However, we haven't quite met the definition. So as I mentioned earlier, I promise I won't be lecturing too much. It's almost over, and then we'll get a little more interactive and look at some of the research. So there's multiple frameworks that we can look at and then look at academic advising against these frameworks to sort of see, have we evolved far enough? Have we hit all of the right attributes in order for us to sort of get to that ultimate goal? So one example of a framework is from Walensky. It's 1964, but it's mentioned in the literature on academic advising. And he argues that occupations go through 4 identifiable stages. And so the first stage is that the creation of a full-time occupation. So there's demand and it has a specialized skill set. So let's start to think about, have we met that criteria? Have we created full-time positions around academic advising? The second criteria is an establishment of schools for training. And so this is where my thesis work, this is where my interest kind of really was piqued around that. The third is a formation of one or more professional associations. So we can think about NACADA here. Do we have a professional association that has outlined, the values that we work as our in how we practice? And then the fourth criteria is establishment of a code of ethics. So looking at these definitions and looking at further research. So when we look at the few articles, and there's actually a site I can share with you afterwards where NACADA has listed all of the articles that pertain to the professionalization of academic advising. A few of them you'll see on the screen. So what we're missing is a body of knowledge. And compared to other occupations, we're doing okay, but we really need to have more people write about and research academic advising, particularly in Canada. There's not a lot of, there is some work being done, but we could really benefit from developing a stronger body of knowledge. Educational requirements. So we'll see from my study that educational requirements aren't yet consistent, at least across the college system in Ontario. Specialized skill set. So again, understanding that what we do is distinguished and different from counseling and maybe sort of front desk support. There's also a piece around self-regulation. So, do we create the parameters and the borders of what we do within our own profession? And then code of ethics and professional association, which we sort of talked about. So as I mentioned earlier, my interest in this topic is really around the educational training, professional development requirements. So why does professionalization matter? It helps us gain autonomy over our work. it helps us, for those of us in management, it helps us vie for resources and sort of build the framework and the arguments that we need to really build this out within our institutions. And it improves our reputation and public understanding of the work that we do. So those are some of the arguments for professionalization. So some of the barriers toward professionalization, and these are taken from Dr. Craig McGill, who I am also working with on a few projects on this topic. He sort of talks about needing to further define the field. And so we'll also look at the research I did in the Ontario colleges to sort of gauge where we are in terms of defining what it is that academic advisors do. He talks about the role of the professional association. So there's some interesting politics where NACADA is associated with an educational institution rather than an independent professional body, and that can create some conflicts of interest there in terms of really pushing our field forward. The training and education required for academic advising is not yet consistent across at least the Ontario college system, and when it comes to hiring. And then the personal occupation autonomy from other professional entities. Some of the barriers that we came up with in Ontario was the use, for example, of the word academic. So academic is informally understood to be the purview of the faculty. And so when it comes to naming academic advisors, sometimes you'll see student success advisor, for example, as a way to distinguish it from the work of the faculty on campus. And then the fourth piece is a consistent home for advising. And again, we'll sort of see in the study, and I'll ask the group as well through Mentimeter, where do you, who do you report to? And then where are you located? Because those factors can also influence how we perceive our job, how others perceive the job, and then have access to the resources that we need to do our jobs well. So I want to know from you why professionalization matters. So knowing that we believe that we are in a profession, now that we sort of see and understand, the frameworks, the journey that we have to go through to become a profession, why do you think it matters within the Canadian context? And we'll give you a few minutes to fill that out. Yeah, this is very exciting. We should definitely keep track of this as we continue with the discussion on this. I see people are coming up with efficiency, quality control, consistency. Those were definitely, when I was starting in academic advising and career advising, those were the things that I was sort of thinking about and wondering about. When a student visits an academic office versus a central service, is there consistency? Yes, exactly. Critical. So I'm reading the chat as well. And these are absolute critical factors for students. Absolutely. If they're not receiving consistent practice, or if the individuals that they're meeting with aren't aware of and knowledgeable about working with various groups of students, then yeah, we can absolutely miss an opportunity to help that student. So thank you for participating in that. So I have way too many slides, and I'll admit that, and we'll just do our best to get through what we get through. I'm going to kind of go quickly through this part because I think the second half of my research study is going to be interesting to the group, especially for those who may have seen me early in the year at NACADA. So just a quick overview of the research study. I focused on academic advising, the professional development of sort of where we were in terms of professional development for academic advisors in the Ontario college system. I chose a mixed methods exploratory study. And so the idea with a mixed methods study is that you start with the qualitative data. So you do some interviews to collect information that gives you a sense of what the state of academic advising is within the college system. And then you engage in the quantitative study. So you take the learning from the interviews and you generalize it to a survey. And then that survey went out across a larger sample of colleges to see to what extent did what we learn in the qualitative study, to what extent is it true for the general population? That's the idea, at least. And part of the goal was to add to the literature on academic advising in Canada and the body of knowledge that we require to move professional development, professionalization forward. So the qualitative study took place at 4 colleges in Ontario. 3 were large and 1 was medium, and they were all urban colleges. The themes that came out of that study, so we were focused on professional development, but really what came out were themes that indicated that we weren't quite ready to address the professional development and training of academic advisors. So one of the themes that came out was the types of advising that advisors engaged in. There was a feeling, and I'll go through the slides later. Actually, I'll do that now. So through the qualitative study, this is the interviews. There was a feeling that a lot of time was spent on transactional advising versus developmental advising, and there was a real desire from the advisors to spend more time on the developmental advising. And there seemed to be a conflict between walk-ins and appointments. So if the model that you work under was walk-in, it felt like the sense was that there wasn't enough time to really address the student needs. And so I think that's where some of the transactional pieces came in versus appointments, where you could sit down and, start a conversation with the student, have them identify their needs, and then you provide the resources that they need to figure out what the next steps are, for example. The second theme that came out was the institutional advising models were not quite consistent. And so they had embedded advisors in some places, and then they had centralized advisors in other places. And sometimes you reported to a student service unit, and sometimes you reported to a faculty unit. And so really the point was like, there's kind of no consistency in terms of how the models are administered. And part of that is we all work in higher education, and sometimes they're very siloed, and academic units will have their own models within their schools, and then we kind of replicate it within student services. There was a sense that academic advisors felt as though they knew what they did, but other people didn't know what they did. So now we could start to question whether or not are we distinguished enough from some of the other positions on campus. Through the interviews, we also looked at, so I went through the data to figure out how academic advisors described what they did. And so here are some of the things that came out through that. They indicated having to know and follow institutional systems, policies, and procedures, retrieve information for students, help them problem solve. I'm not going to read through all of these, but they'll be on the slides provided afterwards. And then we did get to the professional development activities and what everyone was engaged in. And I'll describe individually guided activities. It's a term that comes from the research around professional development. And essentially it speaks to the reading. If you engage yourself in reading, in attending workshops, in anything that you do yourself to enhance and build your practice. The advisors talked about training. So having the institution would provide training for them, like a centralized training. They talked about relying on the Centers for Teaching and Learning, for example, or HR might have some workshops available that they found would be beneficial for them. The other thing that came out very strongly was observation. So a lot of the advisors did have an opportunity to sit and shadow a more experienced advisor, and that was one of the ways that they engaged in learning about their practice. The COP, so a community of practice, I think 3 of the 4 institutions had started a community of practice where the idea was, because advising was sort of spread throughout the college, if we at least come together as a community, we can start to build and enhance our own practice. And it's actually, within the literature, it's actually a really good model for us to start to define the boundaries and distinguish ourselves from other occupations through that sort of ground level work that we do. Deficit model is anytime an advisor indicated that they were lacking in a skill, and then they sought out training on their own to sort of fill that gap in their own knowledge and skill level. There was a lot of advisors wanted to learn about working with diverse student groups, as well as like conflict management. So if a student came in and there was conflict, like how do I de-escalate? How do I help that student? And then the 5th sort of theme that came out was how advisors knew what they were doing was effective. And so that starts to speak to assessment. And so we have the 2 big ones that came out through the qualitative data was reflection. So a lot of advisors spoke about how at the end of the day, they thought about all of the sessions that they had with students. They thought about, did I ask the right questions? Did I give the student the information and resources that they needed? And then the second big one was around student feedback. So there was a feeling that they knew they were doing a good job if a student came back to thank them, if a student made a second appointment, if a student had a success, they got a good grade, they wanted to come back and tell you. This is all great feedback, a way for you to sort of way for them to feel like they were being successful. Okay, so now we're on to, I'm kind of speed through this, but I'm watching the time, but so now we're on the quantitative part of the study. So this is where I took the 5 themes from the qualitative data, built it into a survey to see to what extent the qualitative data could be generalized across a greater population. So within the quantitative study, so this was not presented at caucus in June. We had 38 faculty responses, we had 82 staff responses, and we were able to administer the survey across 14 institutions in Ontario. So the way this next part is going to work is we're going to go back to Mentimeter, and we're going to say, so given the information I just provided on the qualitative study, I'd like you to answer the questions as well, and then we'll see how we compare to the colleges in Ontario. So if you can take a moment and indicate what type of advising do you mostly engage in? And then we'll see how this compares. Okay. So this is interesting because my study was actually, I think the survey went out, might have been 5 years ago now. So I was sort of thinking that the numbers would have changed a little bit, but it's interesting to see that at least for now in this very informal research setting that we're still spending quite a bit of time on informational advising versus developmental advising. Okay. So when I asked sort of the broader college, the staff within the college system in Ontario, they did indicate, about half of them indicated that they did participate in developmental advising. And then the other half sort of indicated informational advising. However, this is where I think it gets interesting, and maybe hopefully other people find it interesting too. Less than half of the respondents spent most of their time advising. So if we think about that, if we think of the additional tasks, the additional work that is placed on the desk of the academic advisors, that's something for us to think about and consider when we're working toward professionalization. How much of that work is really reflective of our positions and the work we want to be doing, and how much of that is from a misunderstanding or not enough resources and staffing to sort of get done. So it seems like ever since the pandemic, been more informational than developmental. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Tracy. It's interesting because I think if I did the study now over the pandemic, it would be interesting to see how this would all have changed. So institutional advising models. So I don't have a lot of time to sort of just go into it, but it should be self-explanatory. Is your academic advising centralized, decentralized, or both? Okay. So these are interesting numbers, and because there's probably advisors from universities here, I sort of expected this to look a little bit different from the colleges in Ontario work as a system. And so we're supposed to be very similar in terms of how we function, but every college has its own unique character and nuance. But what seems to be happening, at least at the time of the study, was that we had a centralized advising service, but then there were also advisors embedded in the school. And sometimes those advisors reported to the central unit, and sometimes they reported to an academic. So at the time of the study, about half of the staff advisors versus the faculty advisors were located in a student service unit. Most of the faculty were located in an academic unit, which was expected. About 3/4 of the staff advisors reported to a student service unit. So there were some staff advisors embedded in the academic school who still perhaps reported centrally. And then again, to be expected, all faculty reported to an academic unit. So why is this important?
Melissa, I just wanted to interrupt because there's a very relevant question in here that could be kind of important. So Kim has asked if you had a sense in the survey results whether advising was the sole role for the respondents, or whether they might have had sort of a part advising role and part something else. And maybe you're kind of speaking to that a little bit here, maybe, but I thought it was very relevant for this part of your presentation here.
Yes, sorry, I didn't see that. Anecdotally, yes. So in the quantitative study, I didn't specifically, so the question I asked was, how much of your time do you spend advising? And the assumption being that the other part of your time, you're not advising. And so the support staff majority of them spent 3/4 of their time advising, but I didn't ask specifically what you spent the other quarter on. If we look at the interview data, what I learned through the interviews is that you spend time doing registrarial functions like adding, dropping courses. When there's big lineups, it's kind of all hands on deck. And so you're sort of answering student questions and triaging them, and probably getting a little bit into, answering questions on OSAP and financial aid and stuffing envelopes and all that kind of stuff. With faculty, it's they're teaching. And in the college system, we have program coordinators, and program coordinators, their job descriptions are purposefully vague. They do academic advising, but it's kind of up to them to decide how they manage their time and how they approach that task. And that's where the consistency piece comes in. So from the interview data, yeah, it's kind of, if you reported to an academic unit, you were more likely to get jobs and functions that don't relate to academic advice. So I hope that answers the question. Sorry, my cat has joined us. Yeah, and again, there is a feeling that there's not a lot of resources and time for developmental advising, absolutely. Okay, so role and responsibility. So I believe that this is an answer. So the role and responsibility is like, what do you do? So maybe this would be a great time for you to add in, when you are advising, what are some of the other functions that you end up doing? And then we can, we'll have a record of it. In terms of your role and responsibilities, what are some of the advising like tasks that you do, and maybe add in what are some of the non-advising tasks that you do? Assisting with course planning and building timetables. Program planning. Oh, academic integrity investigation. That's interesting. Withdrawal meetings. Yeah. So the faculty advisor scheduled classes. So degree planning, discussing electives. So some of this stuff, I think, in discussions with, I think you could argue that some of this, it might not feel like the role of the academic advisor, but there is going to always be a balance of transactional, or what might feel like transactional tasks, versus the developmental, where we sit down and help students plan goals and sort of view their academics from start to finish. Assigning majors. Okay. So it does look like there are some university advisors in here, and I think the level of responsibility looks like it's a little bit different from maybe what we do in the college system. Okay, so I'm going to move on, and then hopefully you can use this for discussion in the follow-up session. So the role and responsibility between staff and faculty advisors in the college system. So staff, you can see that there's some similarities and some differences between what they spent most of their time on. So there was a lot of talking about academic policies. So these are going to be your drop and add dates. Day 10 is a very important day in the college system, making sure that you're in the right program at the right time. So as the staff indicated earlier, they spent 3/4 of their time advising, and so there was time for goal setting. They also did some course selection, program mapping, and then some were focused on sort of learning skills and program selection. So that's a typo. They were focused on learning skills and sort of study skills. I'm going to change that after because I think it's and so referring students to the tutoring center, helping them sort of sort through how to do better. And then the faculty, you can see, yeah, I think this is a typo. My goodness, I must have been asleep when I typed this. Academic policies, course selection, program mapping, and then the career advising as well. So they focused more on how the program that students were engaged with would connect to career outcomes later on. So professional development activities. So curious from this group, what kind of training and PD do you engage in to grow your academic advising skills? And I'm assuming you can all see it. If you're on a phone, I can appreciate it might be tiny. Observation. Okay. Community of practice. So individually guided activities, again, is the sort of the reading and the researching that you might do on your own, meeting other academic advisors to see how they do practice, that sort of thing. Deficit model is focusing on your weaknesses. So maybe you don't have crisis intervention, so you seek that out to enhance your study. Training is, for the purpose of this study, sort of focused on institutional training. So maybe your institution does a yearly advisor training. Okay. So it's interesting that the observation and the individually guided activities are still quite high. And that's what we found with the Ontario colleges as well. So both staff and faculty felt that self-reflection was one of the top ways that they, or one of the activities that they engaged in. Staff were more likely to attend workshops. So again, perhaps HR put on a workshop, or the Teaching and Learning Center, or they, NACADA put on a workshop and you would attend something like that. Staff were more likely to attend advisor training. So that's your institution putting on like a yearly training, for example, and then reading and shadowing. The faculty advisors in the college system, you can see reflection, reading, and then community of practice being higher on their list. And then advisor training. I don't have the percentages here, but it was a very low percentage of faculty who engaged in sort of ongoing training specific to academic advice. Some of the sessions, so there was also a question around, when you attend training, what do you think is the most important to participate in your role? And this is where we start to see some of the PD sessions that are really connected to NACADA, and there are 3 pillars for us. So communication skills was number 1 for both staff and faculty, around being able to open up a conversation with student, being able to get them to share what their issues are, and then help them sort of problem solve. Staff spent a lot of time on problem solving with students, and then student wellness, safety, equity, diversity, inclusion, and then working with unique student populations, so international students, for example, first generation students, that sort of thing. And then we can see with faculty, almost a similar order, but then they worked a little bit more with study skills and learning strategies. They wanted training a little bit more around those kind of topics. So we're almost done. I think I only have a few minutes left. So the last question, and this one is interesting as well, is how do you know that you're doing that you're meeting student needs? And so if we take one more minute just to sort of say, how do you assess your advising practice? Is it through self-reflection, student feedback, student surveys, data from the institution, or manager feedback? Okay, so we're seeing sort of similar results in terms of reflection and student feedback being still really informing our practice. Okay, and so you'll see from the survey that was conducted that student feedback was still sort of top for faculty and staff. Student surveys and retention data was harder to come by. It's not available to everyone. And then manager feedback was lower on the list as well. So the next, we only have 2 minutes, but so what does this all mean? So what does it mean? What do our reporting structures and our locations and our, how we assess our practice and, how does that all sort of connect and come together in the end? I think the common sort of strings between all of this is really, we have to think about consistency across the system. We have to think about to what extent have we distinguished academic advising from other functions across campus? What extent are we regulating the work that we do? So when we think about all the extra stuff that we have on our tables, have we really, is there something we can do there? Do we all have a clear focus and understanding of what the purpose and value of academic advising is at the institution? Is there consistency among our roles and responsibilities and how we ourselves approach academic advising? And then again, to what extent do reporting lines and locations, and for the inconsistency of how academic advising is administered across our campuses, to what extent is that sort of creating a barrier for us as academic advisors? These are things to think about. These are, I think it's exciting to think about these things and to what extent can we influence this? Now that we have this community of practice through caucus, can we design goals over the next few years for ourselves to start to really address some of these issues? We can also talk about, do we all have to have the same job description? Do we all have to have the same definitions? And the answer to that is really no, but we do need to think about how we can just align things a little bit more so that to benefit the profession. And I'm going to stop there and pass it back to our hosts.
Thank you so much, Melissa. This was really, truly so interesting. And I'm already excited. We know that these sessions go so quickly and that we often don't get time to ask questions and to engage in discussion in our community of practice. So one of the things that we are trying to do this year is offering follow-up sessions to see if we can sort of continue this discussion and maybe talk a little bit more about what Melissa has left us with today. I feel like there's a lot of nuggets to pick up on and talk about in a couple weeks. So I'm just going to pop into the chat the registration link if anybody is interested in attending that and sort of continuing to talk about this. And you know, I love this slide actually that you've ended on, like, what are these implications? I think you're you know, there's a lot of the big picture stuff up here, but I'm really curious to start that discussion with this group to think about what are the implications for us sort of individually at a low level in our institutions and in our individual roles. So I think that that's where we'll probably pick up in a couple of weeks. But in the meantime, I just wanted to say thank you so much again, Melissa. This was really great. And I hope that there are others in this group as well feel that they got something out of this. So we appreciate everybody's attendance today.
Thank you for attending. It's exciting to talk about my research among people who hopefully find it as interesting as I do. Sometimes it can be a very solitary endeavor, and to find to see it have some impact would be sort of amazing. So thank you for coming, everyone.